Good morning. I am going to create a series of short videos specific to each topic that I wanted to address this month for the LEA Special Ed Coordinators meeting. I thought that way you'll be able to listen to it when it's convenient for you. It won't be such a long video at once. And also if there are topics that you need right away, you can get to them, or topics that maybe you don't feel apply right now, then you can just skip over those. So this is going to be our first one. And I'm going to share my screen real quick so I can give you an overview of what we're going to cover in these series. Okay, so this video will be specifically around the eligibility and evaluation Q&A documents. Additional videos will be about picking and choosing services, graduation, ISASP, the new state assessment, and things around accessibility and accommodations. And then there will be something on expanded core, and then ESY I actually have built into kind of just some reminders, and I'm actually going to start with that. The first thing on our updates is extended school year, and I wanted to just remind you that this is coming up. Summer will be here before we know it, and that teams should be starting to have conversations about ESY for students. Your goal is going to be to want to have those finished by the end of March if possible. And the reason for that is procedures outline that parents need to have adequate time to express concerns about any of those ESY decisions that have been made, to exercise their due process rights, or some other sort of dispute resolution. And so need to start getting ready for those and having those meetings coming up here. The other things around ESY that I just like to always provide reminders about is that is an individualized decision based on the unique needs of the student. It doesn't necessarily need to look like what you do during the school year. So you're really identifying which of their goals are needed during the summer. So you might not be working on all the goals, you might be working on just a portion. And then what is it that they really need to work on? And so it could look very different than the school year potentially. The other thing to keep in mind is if you offer a summer program, that may meet the ESY needs for some students, and for others it may not. Some students, summer school plus maybe some extra things will meet their needs. Other students might need something completely different. So it is an individualized decision that you need to make. The second update is just about exit codes. The special ed directors across the state have been looking at these codes, and we are looking at removing the code RRT from the procedures manual. And so we'll be moving away from using that code here at Keystone. There are other codes that more accurately describe what's going on in the situation, and so there isn't going to be a need to use that one. Third thing is just a new IEP system. It's still kind of held up in court. One of the vendors has disputed the RFP process. We're waiting for the ruling on that. Unfortunately, because it's taking so long, we will likely end up staying in our current system a little longer than we had hoped. And then the last thing is just an exciting development around procedures. We're working on a new web-based tool. This will replace the current procedures manual, which is about 600+ page PDF document. We have a vendor established, and our goal is to have at least a good portion of that ready to go by fall. Okay, so we'll move back to eligibility and evaluation standards. And these were created as a joint effort between the Department of Ed and the AEA Special Ed directors, and they're in response to the changes that we've been required to make due to a due process situation in our state. So a couple years ago, there was the AW case. I've talked to you about that a couple times over the years, and there were a couple rulings that came out of it that really required us to provide better clarity for our staff and for schools around making eligibility decisions. And two of the big things around it was the use of discrepancy data and how do you determine need. And so we have developed two Q&A documents that I think are really good. And I don't want to sit and read them to you, but I do want to highlight a few things in each one. And so I'm going to start with the discrepancy data document. I know I sent these out in my report this month, and if you're like me, finding time to sit down and read and digest can be kind of tricky. So the front page is really just an overview of the reason we're doing this and the authority to be able to provide this guidance. The DE always has to lay out that authority when they issue any kind of documents. So the first question asks, is it appropriate to use discrepancy data to determine if a learner does or does not have a disability? And remember, this is talking about initial evaluation and reevaluations, which includes exit. So the question of, do we use discrepancy data? Because this is a real myth right now in our state. There are people saying, well, discrepancy doesn't matter. And that really isn't true. Discrepancy still is a piece of the process. And so this really talks about that you really do need that information to help you identify if there is some sort of problem. You're kind of defining the problems, you're validating what you think, you're describing the intensity or the degree of the problem, trying to help figure out what do we need to dig deeper into. That is what discrepancy does for us. It really helps us identify, is there even a problem? And what it doesn't do is tell us what we're going to do about it. That is the deeper diagnostic assessment that we need to do around reviewing records, interviewing teachers, observing students, maybe using some tests if we need the information, but really focusing on what information do we have to help us know what the student needs. So certainly it is appropriate and has to be part of the process to use discrepancy data. Here's what became problematic that we're trying to really help folks understand, and that's the idea of cut points. And so there was guidance before and kind of a practice of, well, you had to be so far behind before you would be eligible. And so things like the 12th percentile or 2 times discrepant or more than one standard deviation, those were out there. They really were never intended to be these true black and white lines, but that's kind of how they got implemented. And so that's what we're really moving back away from, is there is no specific number within discrepancy that makes the decision. It's the convergence of all of this information that helps us. And the reason for that is it's very clearly written here that in law it says, regardless of the severity of their disability, those in need of special education and related services must be identified, located, and evaluated. And so we can't say, oh, there's a certain number and you have to hit this to get it. It depends on the situation. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move down here. The other piece of that is that by setting this certain spot, you really have to wait for kids to fail. And that isn't the model of special education either, because for some reason, there will be some reasons that maybe a student isn't that far behind. For instance, they're getting a whole bunch of supports. They're getting lots of intervention in their day. We have provided all kinds of accommodations in the classroom. Parents are doing a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe they're getting some outside support. So they don't look that discrepant, but it's only because of the intensity of everything we've done. And we need to think about that. And the team can use that to help them make a decision. So that's really why that idea of cut points is gone. We're not using that. And so think about that too at the reevaluation time, that it would be completely inappropriate to just look at their Iowa assessment data or their district-wide data and say, well, they're not discrepant anymore, so they don't get special ed. That's one piece of the data. We would look at that to help us, but that isn't the only piece of data. I think we all can think of students that on their assessment information, they might look really pretty good, but then when you talk about all the supports that they have to make them successful, you think, oh my goodness, there's no way they could make it without special ed. And that's really what this guidance is trying to say, is every decision is unique, and there can't be just this black and white line that we use to make those decisions. So then the next question says, is requiring a significant discrepancy illegally narrowing the identification? And if it is, I'm sorry, I'm not reading that very well. If doing that is illegally narrowing the identification, what does inadequate but not significant discrepant performance look like? So basically people are saying, okay, if we can't use cut scores, what's good, what's bad, how do we make these decisions? And so this answer really talks about the fact that we should be looking at grade and age level expectations. We should really be looking at the standards for that grade level and comparing that student to that standard, and If the child's performance is considered adequate, which might not be right at standard, it might be below, but is similar to their peers, then we would consider their performance adequate, which is really an important distinction for us to think about. So we need to look at, what do we expect for all children? How do other children in our school do on those same expectations? And how does this student compare? And that's really what helps us look at that discrepancy piece. The caution here is that in a school that maybe in general this class is not performing well, we have kind of an underachieving class, and sometimes that happens. You seem like you have a grade level that comes through, that you have one that's just really, really high flyers, and then you got another group that they are a lot of students struggling to learn. So we have to take that into consideration also, because there still could be a student with a disability in that class, and we need to find them and identify them. So just because everybody's doing poorly doesn't automatically say, oh, we can't even look at that student because everybody's doing poorly. We need to dig deeper than that. So this answer, take a few minutes and read through that, because I think it really helps. So the number 4 talks about, can a child who is performing adequately be identified as a student with a disability? And I've alluded to this a little bit, but I really want to talk about this, because a team must not determine that a child is eligible unless they find that the child does not perform adequately in one or more of the performance areas. And I think that's really important, because one of the myths out there right now is that, well, now that we don't have cut scores, any kid can get special education. And that is absolutely not true. It really has to be a student with a disability. And we decide that by looking at progress, discrepancy, and need. And so they still have to have at least one of those domains that they're not performing adequately in. However, we have to remember that caveat of what other supports have been provided. So if they are looking kind of okay, but there has been so much intensity put into that, then we need to take that into consideration to say, well, maybe they really do have an issue there. They really aren't performing adequately because they can't do it without all of these supports. And so it really is a combination of these two things that we have to think about, as far as how far behind are they? And if they're not that far behind, how much support have we provided? And those two things together help us make some decisions about the discrepancy information. How discrepant is a student? Now remember, discrepancy is only one piece of the puzzle. So we're just talking about that one little piece. We still need to look at progress, and we need to look at need as part of that whole package. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one talks about determining need. And this one I find really, really helpful too. I personally think these documents have done a tremendous job of providing clarity that I hope helps teams. So again, the beginning is that same overview with the authority. And then the first question talks about, are there times that a child who is benefiting from RTI or MTSS may also need special education? And I think this is a great question. And the answer is yes. Because MTSS is not a gen ed thing or a special ed thing. It's an all kid thing. So there may be a student who is involved in MTSS for, let's say, math, but also has a reading IEP, because it isn't an exclusive thing that you get one or the other. MTSS serves all our students, and it's really looking at that intensity and whether the student has a disability on whether those services are provided through general education instruction, or whether it's coming through special education instruction if they need that. So I think that's really important to think that those aren't two separate things. There may be times that the intervention that's happening in your MTSS system becomes special education for that student. There are other times it does not. It really depends on the situation. And I think as we go through this document, it'll help you with some kind of thinking points. So the second question says, if a gen ed teacher can provide the instruction, isn't that considered gen ed? And that was actually one of the big cruxes of the AW case. This was a student who, through their MTSS system, they were providing all kinds of supports, and this, I'm saying she, but I don't even know if it was a she. She made nice progress through the supports that they provided. And so she was getting some extra help from the teacher. She was in an intervention group. The principal was meeting with her at lunchtime to work on her math. They had kind of figured out all of these things to help her. The decision, or the judge said, yeah, that's great, except that you provided a really, really lot of intense things for a student that you know had a diagnosis and reason to think it might be a disability. And she needed it for a long time. Just because gen ed can provide it doesn't mean that didn't turn into specially designed instruction for that student, and we should have been guaranteeing it for her through an IEP. And so what she says here is that specially designed instruction, which is what an IEP guarantees you, is really about that modification of instruction to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability, and that the location of the instruction is unimportant in this definition. It can happen in the gen ed setting, it can happen in the special ed setting, it can happen in homes, it can happen in hospitals, it can happen in institutions. If the location isn't the issue, it's really about what are we doing for that student. And so we can't make the assumption that if a gen ed teacher can provide it, it's just automatically gen ed. The other caveat of that is that special education services, if that's determined what they need, by rule and by law, has to be planned and overseen by a special ed teacher. So it's not, the game changes when we start talking about special education as far as a special ed teacher has to be involved. However, that doesn't mean that if the gen ed teacher or the intervention teacher is really making great gains with that student, that they have to stop that thing and go work with the special ed teacher. The special ed teacher could just start collaborating with that person who knows the student, who's doing some great things, and they can keep that going and guarantee it through an IEP with maybe some more rigorous monitoring. So I think that that's a really important thing for us to think about. Question 3 talks about the difference between gen ed and special ed. And I'm not going to read through all of these bullets, but I would encourage you to think about what are the things that happen in gen ed. And within your MTSS system, we are providing differentiated instruction and remedial groups and extra opportunities to practice. All of that is gen ed, and we need to keep that being gen ed. When you start talking about special education, you're really talking about those adaptations to content, methodology, and delivery that meet the unique needs of a student resulting from a disability. And that's why, again, need is not the only prong of the decision. If all we did was look at, well, this student needs a lot of instruction, we could make a faulty decision about having a disability, because it has to be those 3 prongs: progress, discrepancy, and need, that help us make that decision. So if you take anything away from this, take away that it's a culmination or a convergence of data around these 3 prongs, and not any one thing that we've talked about can be taken kind of out of context and used to make that decision. The last part here, I think, is really, really powerful, because I think this is a kind of vague concept. And so as the team is gathering information to decide whether a student has a disability and whether they need special education, if the team has decided, yeah, we have the data to say they have a disability, now they need to decide, do they need special ed to meet those needs for their disability? This really talks about, okay, so what are the characteristics of the learning environment that best support the learner? So have that conversation. What is it the student needs as far as the setting that they need to work in to be successful? And then talk about how similar or different is this from what happens for their peers, for their age and grade level students. How different is it? Then talk about curriculum. What are the standards, the concepts, the skills that this student needs to learn? Identify those. Now talk about how different is that from what we do for their peers. Do the same for instruction. If you lay that all out and you go, it's not very different than what we do for other kids, you're probably talking about general education and differentiated instruction. If you talk about the student and go, wow, we really are doing some things that are very different than we do for other students, or he needs some things that are very different from other students, now you're likely talking about special education. So there is no magic line that says, oh, this is special ed and this is gen ed. It really is a continuum, and the team has to have a really rich discussion around that. And so as part of the evaluation process, the AEA is really responsible for helping to gather all of that information from the teachers, from the parents, from observations, from interviews, from looking at all of the records for the student, and then gathering some information if they need to do some task type things with the student to really dig diagnostically. And they're pulling kind of all of that information together so that the team can talk about it and ultimately make a decision about special education. The most important thing is that data is what's driving that decision. There is no there's no moving around the data and saying, well, I know it says this, but we really think he needs it. It has to be driven by the data. And then there's a couple other questions down here that I think are good to think about. So how long do they need this instruction? If it's something that you think you can remediate in 3 or 4 weeks, we're probably not talking about special education. Maybe even 6 or 8 weeks or a semester. But if they need it long-term, you're probably talking about special education. How might the student respond if the instruction was removed? What do you think would happen if we quit doing all of these things? Does he have the skill now and he'll be okay? Or is he going to fall flat because he absolutely has to have those supports to be successful? I think it's a question we don't always ask. We just assume kids need, and I think it's important to stop and talk about. And then what is the degree to which the needed instruction is individualized versus routinely provided through differentiation? And I think that just kind of is a culmination of all of those things. So I hope that me taking time to walk through those was helpful for you. Again, remember, this is initial evaluation, but it's also reevaluation, which includes exit. And so these conversations should be happening each time we're talking about whether a student is eligible for special education. There are going to be a couple more of these Q&A documents coming out throughout the winter and into the spring. I'll be sure to get those to you as they come. In addition, the evaluation and eligibility standards are being revised to align with this guidance and with what we learned from the AW case. That I'm guessing those will be out for fall so that we have updated information, as well as the procedures manual will be aligned so that everything will kind of mesh now, because we're kind of in a situation of the guidance doesn't necessarily match what we've heard because we're still working on getting it all hooked together. So that is all coming. If you have questions about any of the videos today, I am going to include in my email a link to a place for questions. If you want to put your question on there, I'll try to create a Q&A doc that I can send back out if there's lots of questions. It'll also give me a sense of, do we need to have a live Zoom just to talk about some of these topics? My intent was to be live this month, and I had lots on my calendar, and in my conversations with some administrators, it felt like everybody had lots going, and I thought maybe a video would just be easier. If you prefer live, please give me that feedback also. If you don't feel comfortable putting it in the Google Doc, go ahead and just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to talk about some of these things. Coordinators are also more than happy to talk. They are up to speed on this information, and we're here to support. So this is the end of the first video. I look forward to seeing you in the future ones here.